as you're now all aware. So my name is Christopher Hope. I work for the Bretton Woods Project, which is a watchdog on the IMF and the World Bank based in London to look closely at the policies and practices of the fund and the bank, which at least in part then means that we have a lot of shared interests and areas of focus as the IEO. So we're very happy to have the opportunity to showcase some of their most recent research and to get it discussed openly with interested members of civil society. So, I mean, you're all aware, naturally, of the role of the IEO, but to make it relatively stated, it's to provide evaluations on issues of relevance to the mandate of the IMF. And the idea of the event today is that we will discuss this paper, we'll discuss the findings of their research on growth and adjustment in IMF-supported programs. And then the idea is that the members of civil society and academics on the call can interject and share their opinions. The subject matter of this, looking really at how well IMF-supported programs can sustain economic growth whilst focusing on the priority balance of payment concerns that predominate IMF work, is obviously extremely relevant in terms of understanding global economics, but it's also especially relevant to academics and members of civil society interested in the IMF. As you know, thinking about the impact of the fund on development is essential to what a lot of us are interested in. In terms of how the discussion will be taking place today, then, we have 4 participants who I'll just introduce quickly to you all now, so that we're starting from the same page. But we have from the IEO first Jun Kim, who's advisor and alternate senior budget manager at the IEO, previously having spent some 16 years working at the IMF, and he has also served as deputy governor to the Bank of Korea and led the team that produced this most recent evaluation that we will be discussing today. We're also lucky to have Charles Collyns, who is the director of the IEO and has been so since 2017, as many of you are aware, and who previously had worked at institutions including the US Treasury. Then on the civil society side of things, and people who will be commenting on the paper, firstly we have Chiara Mariotti, senior policy and advocacy advisor focused on development finance at Eurodad, who most of you will be aware of, the European Network on Debt and Development. Chiara has looked a lot at the work of the IMF in her work and advocacy there. And then finally, we have as an academic representative, let's say, Rebecca Ray, senior academic researcher at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, as very eloquently presented by the image behind Rebecca of Shanghai, as just discussed. Some of Rebecca's recent research includes IMF austerity since the global financial crisis in that last year, and is evidently of relevance to the discussion that we'll be hopefully able to have today. Running order in terms of how I'd like us to sort of choreograph this discussion. Firstly, we will have the presentation from the IEO, both Jun and Charles, but starting with Jun, and between them I have 20 minutes roughly to present. Then we have our 2 discussants, the aforementioned Chiara and Rebecca. Starting with Chiara, each of those discussants will have 12 minutes to comment their reflections on the recently published report. And then we should have ample time for a Q&A. The event is an hour and a half, so in theory, if we run a tight ship, then we'll have at least 35 minutes to discuss amongst ourselves and raise any questions, both for the IEO representatives and also for the CEO and academic, CSO and academic representatives who are serving as discussants. If you would like to ask a question when we get to that throughout, you can post your questions in the chat box, and I can serve some kind of role as a sort of repository of questions, or you can just put a star in if you would like the floor to slightly embellish the point that you would like to make, which is completely fine in the circumstances. So with that all said, let me please pass to Jun, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Chris, and thank for a very kind introduction. Let me begin by thanking the Bretton Woods Project for hosting this event, and Chiara and Rebecca for providing their thoughtful comments. For presentation, I think Joshua will share the slides. Okay, thank you, Joshua. Can you move to the next slide? Okay, the main objective of this evaluation is to assess how well IMF-supported programs have helped to help support economic growth while delivering necessary adjustment for external viability, and then draw lessons on the fund's lending and conditionality framework and make recommendations. This evaluation was motivated by the IMF's mandate as specified in the Articles of Agreement, which calls for helping members to correct BOP problems without resorting to measures destructive of national or international prosperity, as well as criticism on the fund's austerity bias and lackluster growth outcomes of fund programs, and also insufficient attention to growth in staff guidance on program conditionality. Next slide, please. The evaluation covers IMF financing arrangements with conditionality approved and completed between September 2008 and March 2020, but not those arranged after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Main findings and lessons are based on 6 thematic studies and 17 country case studies across 5 regions, all of which are posted in the IO's website. Next slide, please. Regarding the structure of the presentation, I will present key findings of the evaluation as well as some general lessons from country case studies, and then Charles will discuss the evaluation's recommendations and next steps. My presentation will cover key findings on growth and adjustment aspects of IMF programs, including empirical evidence on growth outcomes, growth optimism, and the range of growth supporting measures in the program context, such as fiscal policy, structural reforms, exchange rate policy, and market debt operations. Next slide, please. Let me first discuss the findings on the growth aspects of the program. The IMF's increasing attention to supporting activity during a program and fostering medium-term growth seems to have delivered some positive results. Program growth outcomes, which are represented by the blue line on the chart on the left, showed U-shaped trajectory in GRA programs with the trough in the first year of the program, which is particularly pronounced in crisis GRA programs arranged in response to the global financial crisis and euro area debt crisis. In contrast, growth outcomes were much steadier in other GRA programs and in PRGT programs as well, with significantly less cross-country variation than in crisis programs, as indicated in the chart by the interquartile range in shade. More formal empirical evidence supports that the growth effects of the program are more positive than this simple picture might suggest, as we will see in the next 2 slides. Next slide, please. In sum, we did not find evidence of a consistent bias toward excessive austerity in fund programs during the evaluation period. Cross-country evidence suggests that relative to a counterfactual of no fund engagement, both GRA and PRGT programs, when completed, have yielded gross benefits during the program in the order of 0.7 to 1.1 percentage points. Evidence also suggests larger benefits for completed programs with stronger implementation and higher depths of structural conditions than otherwise, aided in part by the confidence effect. Next slide, please. The evaluation also looked at the program gross outcomes relative to a benchmark, which could be considered as a country-specific historical norm and is estimated by using country-specific trends and external factors only. Except in the crisis context, as you see in the chart on the left, program gross outcomes were broadly in line with historical norms. Specifically, gross deviations from the estimated historical norms are negative and often large enough to be statistically significant in crisis GRA programs, which is represented in a dark blue bar in the chart, but less so or even positive in other GRA programs and as well as in PRGT programs. After these findings on short-term gross impact of IMF programs, the remaining question would be, what are the implications for medium to long-term growth of the IMF programs? As will be discussed later, the evaluation found that stabilizations and reforms implemented during the program have affected post-program growth positively. For the longer run growth impact, we looked at historical data over the period 1980 to 2010 and found that IMF programs have played a positive role at initiating sustained growth surges of 80 years or longer, and more so in the 2000s than in the previous 2 decades. Next slide, please. Notwithstanding these positive findings, program growth outcomes consistently fell short of program projections, more so in GRA than in PRGT programs. More specifically, 1/2 of the programs experienced a growth shortfall of 0.5 percentage points or more, while 1/4 had a growth shortfall of over 1.5 percentage points. What are the sources of such growth optimism? Cross-country evidence suggests that less realistic assumptions on fiscal multipliers, which were not discussed widely in program documents, have been a source, especially in GRA programs outside of a crisis context. Case studies also show that the political economic factors in program negotiations, such as pressures on fund staff and authorities to agree on excessively sanguine projections, hoping to sustain domestic support, motivated ambitious growth projections, while program design paid limited attention to contingencies to respond to growth shortfalls. Next slide, please. Now, let me turn to the adjustment aspects of the program, focusing on growth supporting policies and reforms. Fiscal policies typically incorporated growth-friendly measures, but with mixed success. For instance, tax mobilization improved in PRGT programs, providing some fiscal space for productive public investment. In GRA programs, the post-program tax structure became more growth-friendly, although fiscal adjustment relied heavily on spending cuts during the program. However, health and education spending did not increase significantly in either PRGT or GRA programs, and protection of low-income and vulnerable groups fell short of program goals. Moreover, gross benefits of higher public investment were limited by poor project selection and wasteful implementation, especially in PRGT programs. To help address these concerns, more attention needs to be paid to improving public financial management and governance, as well as monitoring and reporting on the social and distributional impact. Next slide, please. Empirical evidence suggests that structural conditionality generally helps to promote growth during and after programs, with a stronger growth impact for structural conditions with higher depth and growth orientation. So this evidence tells us that IMF programs had also a medium-term positive growth impact. However, the potential growth benefits were not fully realized because the bulk of conditions was oriented to stabilization rather than growth promotion, and of relatively low depth and growth orientation. As you can see in the chart on the left, about 2/3 of the structural conditions were related to demand management, and about a quarter is related to vulnerability management, such as improving the financial soundness of banks and other financial institutions. And actually, the structural conditions geared toward growth promotion accounted for only about 10% of the total number of structural conditions. In addition, capacity development assistance has not been consistently effective in strengthening the implementation of structural conditions. The evaluation indeed found that implementation was significantly weaker in areas outside of fund expertise and where collaboration with partners was sought. These findings suggest structural conditionality should focus on deeper and more growth-supporting reforms, supported by closer integration of program and city work and stronger collaboration with relevant partners, particularly the World Bank. Next slide, please. It is well known that in the face of an external shock, exchange rate depreciation can help support growth while facilitating external adjustment via expenditure switching. However, the use of exchange rate as a policy tool was quite limited in the program context. Exchange regime transition was infrequent and more often toward greater fixity than flexibility. And PRGT programs relying on the exchange rate anchor tended to lose their competitiveness. Nevertheless, it is notable that program efforts were typically made to correct significant pre-program overvaluation. Cross-country analysis also found that significant real effective depreciation, where occurred, supported external adjustment and growth, particularly in PRGT programs. These findings suggest that there would be greater scope to use the exchange rate as a policy tool, while at the same time respecting the country's regime choice and avoiding exchange rate manipulation, particularly if a supporting policy framework, such as a deep foreign exchange market and the credible inflation anchor, is already in place. Next slide, please. Before discussing the findings on debt operations, I'd like to highlight that the evaluation focused on the experience of market debt operations only and excluding official debt operations, which have been discussed extensively elsewhere. In a number of cases, market debt operations were quite useful in restoring their sustainability and supporting growth. In the program context, as you can see on the left chart, debt operations with principal haircuts and upfront fiscal adjustment were more successful than debt reprofiling or simple coupon reduction in renewing market access and restoring growth. However, debt operations were sometimes too little and too late for various reasons. This experience suggests that while respecting the neutrality principle, the IMF should seek to ensure ambitious debt operations upfront based on a very careful application of the DSA framework. Next slide, please. While the findings discussed thus far are obtained largely from cross-country analysis, country case studies offered many valuable lessons based on a diverse country experience. Let me summarize 3 general lessons from country case studies. First, there is no simple recipe for delivering better growth outcomes in IMF programs, given the variety of country circumstances and preferences. For any recipe to be successful, however, the adjustment and growth strategy should be fully owned by the government and broadly supported. Second, the groundwork for a successful policy response should ideally be laid well in advance through surveillance and city work, because meaningful reforms take several years to put in place and become effective, even with capacity development support by the fund. Third, growth and reform strategies should pay adequate attention to social and distributional consequences. Fair distribution of burden of adjustment and the rewards of recovery are of prime importance to meet national goals and also to ensure continued public support for program implementation. I will stop here and Charles will present the evaluations, recommendations, and next steps. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jun. That was really an excellent exposition of a huge amount of work that you and your team have done to prepare the evaluation. I will briefly go over the main recommendations of the report and the reactions to the report from management at the executive board and the next steps. But first, let me say that I guess the overall message of the evaluation is that while we did not find evidence that the fund excessively squeezes economies at the expense of growth in order to achieve adjustment, and that as Jun said, the presence of the fund program was actually positive relative to countries that avoided going to the fund when they faced balance of payments problems. At the same time, and perhaps even more important, programs too often fell short of their growth objectives, so that there is really a need to pay more attention to supporting growth in IMF programs. And that's really the foundation for our first recommendation, that the attention to growth implications in IMF programs should become much more thorough, it should be systematic, it should be realistic, and it should be sensitive to social and distributional consequences. There needs to be more attention in designing programs to analyzing the growth implications of the program and how they fit with the country's growth strategy and objectives. These should be discussed more clearly in program documents provided to the board. These documents should also pay more attention to the quality aspects of growth. And while the empirical evidence that Jun has presented largely relates to aggregate GDP, it's just as important to pay more attention to the distributional aspects, impact on inequality, impact on inclusion, impact on environmental sustainability. We weren't able to evaluate in a systematic way these aspects because of the lack of data, but that does not mean that they are not just as important. As Jun said, there should be more attention to looking at fiscal multiplier assumptions to avoid excessive growth impact from fiscal adjustments where it's needed. And there should be more attention to thinking about growth contingencies, how to respond if growth does indeed fall short of program objectives, despite greater attention being paid. So that's a broad initial set of recommendations that we made. Second recommendation on the next slide, picking up in particular the work on structural conditionality done by the team. We recommend that the fund programs need to pay greater attention to supporting deeper, more growth-oriented structural reforms. As Jun says, the structural reforms in IMF programs are dominated by adjustment measures. We feel that this really is a missed opportunity, because too often adjustment programs leave in place the deeper impediments to growth, such that even though short-term adjustment may be achieved, the economy does not move to a stronger growth path. But dealing with this requires being willing to tackle underlying distortions, removing structural impediments to growth. But often these impediments are not in areas where the fund has deep expertise. So that a key aspect of a more growth-oriented reform program will be working closely with partners like the World Bank, as well as providing stronger support through the fund's capacity development. And then thirdly, the third recommendation on the next page is that the fund should continue to invest in building a toolkit of models and monitors to analyze the adjustment growth relationship. It's important to develop models that can be applied in the program context and that are suitable for countries that do not have the depth of data that one might wish for. So you need to be realistic in building models. And then these country teams, these models should be applied by country teams in close collaboration with authorities, so that officials also understand the basis for the projections that are being made. And then finally, more attention needs to be paid to developing the monitors of distributional impact of programs, so that the early warning can be obtained of where programs are having unintended adverse consequences on social issues, or where they're not achieving the social goals or distributional goals that programs have. And then final slide for me is on the reactions and follow-up. We received very strong support, in fact, from both the managing director and the board to the report. Perhaps not surprising. Managing director and board were pleased by the positive findings on growth impact, but at the same time they also recognized and bought into our conclusion that growth outcomes too often fell short of objectives, and that the fund did indeed need to pay more attention to ensuring stronger growth outcomes in its program work. Executive directors found the report as being extremely timely, given that the fund is now entering a period where it expects to receive a substantial number of applications for fund resources to deal with the continuing after effects of the pandemic. So I think executive directors really felt that this was a moment when greater attention to the growth aspects was particularly relevant, as countries are struggling to deal with the drag from the pandemic. At the same time, I should reflect that there were some qualifications made by directors that will need to be considered as the fund moves to implement the recommendations. First of all, a number of directors emphasized that it should not be forgotten that the fund's core objective in lending resources is to help the country resolve its balance of payments needs, and that growth should not in any way undercut the country's adjustment efforts. So it's a matter of achieving both rather than trading one off against the other. And then the other is the question of how far fund conditionality should be looking at areas of particularly related to growth objectives. We feel quite strongly that there does need to be that shift. Not that the fund needs to hire people in areas where it does not have expertise, but instead it needs to work more effectively and closely with partners like the World Bank and regional development banks in order to be able to tackle more effectively the distortions, imbalances that are holding back growth in too many countries. In terms of next steps, after the board meeting, management and staff have 6 months to put together an implementation plan. So we expect that plan to be coming back to the board in March of 2022. And then the board needs to approve that implementation plan so that the board has a chance to push management and staff to take stronger, more ambitious actions if they feel that the implementation plan is not adequately addressing the evaluation recommendations. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Charles, thanks very much, and thank you, Jun, as well, for a very comprehensive overview, both of the content of the report and then also the dynamics around its reception, Charles, which you were just touching on at the end, which is really appreciated, and that's part of the discussion. But now we'll pass on to the next section of the roundtable, namely the comments from our two CSO and academia representatives. Starting first with Chiara, I would say actually that we'll have first the comment from Chiara and then the comment from Rebecca. I think at that point I'd invite Charles and Jun to come back with any initial reflections on that as sort of the equivalent of the first round of the Q&A, just to make sure that we're engaging with that content. So Chiara, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and thanks for inviting me. I think we have been in conversations a few times this year, and it's actually good to have follow up to the different conversations. So you actually might have heard my comments before. And I'm going to focus on three things in particular: on the austerity bias, and on the adjustment part, on the structural conditions, and on growth. And I realize that some of these comments are for the IEO, and actually others are also for the IMF. It's a little bit difficult to distinguish exactly what speaks to one and what speaks to other, but they are very much connected. Anyway, on the adjustment, or actually more generally, I really like the recommendations that come out from the report. I thought that they were all very much on point and aligned with many of the things that civil societies have been raising. But in a sense, they were accompanied by a tone that personally I found a bit too much congratulatory on the grounds of what actually the finding of the report were. And this is something that I think is reflected. There are a few contradictions between what is found, some of the findings that are highlighted in the report, and then the headline conclusions. And the one that really stood up for me was that the report states that the evaluation doesn't find evidence of a consistent bias towards excessive austerity. Now, I found that the analysis and the evidence that is in the report doesn't actually support such a strong and definitive finding, not least because at least I wasn't able to find it. I might have overlooked it. What is meant with excessive austerity? At times it seems that the presence of positive output growth is taken as an indicator of lack of austerity. And also there are some of the findings that point to the fact that, for instance, that GRA programs relied heavily on spending cuts to achieve adjustment, definition of austerity, I think, and that health and education spending did not increase significantly in either PRGT or GRA programs. Now, this of course depends also on factors outside an IMF program, and it's true that many of these programs included indicative targets that established floors for social spending, but none of these is in its own an evidence of absence of an austerity bias, especially if they come with recommendations to target such spending, which in so many countries does amount to say, well, you have to adjust your social programs towards and implement austerity cuts. This in a sense has emerged from some of the comments that Charles has made at the end, that part of this has to do also with lack of data, but an assessment of whether fiscal adjustment is accompanied by austerity as we mean it in a large sense should be accompanied by an assessment of trends in public and social spending and how this impacts on a range of social indicators, in particular gender and economic inequality. And so this is something that comes up in the recommendation, in the first recommendations, the putting more emphasis on the systematic impact assessments of programs, and so this is something very encouraging, and so it's reassuring that it's there as the first recommendation. The second point that I wanted to comment on, I'll try to be quicker here, is on structural conditionality. I'm coming with my comments here from let's say the opposite perspective. I work for an organization that doesn't like conditionality at all. So what the way in which I'm going to challenge this is that part of the analysis is taking a very uncontroversial and unquestioning approach to dealing with conditionality, taking for granted that they work, they are useful to achieve the program's target, and and to improve the implementation. That if something that goes wrong, then the reason is something else. Well, you might as well consider that the problem is the fact that some measures are pushed on countries exactly through conditionality that might be part of the problem, and the fact that their use in the long term erodes public ownership and participation, especially if not done in a certain way. And you might not be able to see this from the analysis of a single program, but of course this is a result of a trend of relationship and power dynamics between the fund and country governments over time. And then I'm not really sure how much time I have, but I wanted to comment on all the analysis on growth. And this I really hope that this is something you're going to look more and from different angles in the future, and also that we as civil societies are going to engage more with the fund. There is a quote in the report that says that accelerating the process of economic growth in a sustained manner is just about the most important policy issue in economics. And except that it is not the main issue in economics right now. The main issue is to achieve an energy transition with equitable outcomes. And this is where the IMF needs to put its brains, other international institutions need to put their brains, and where you have to play a key role in pushing the institution. And I really appreciated the workshop that you organized a few months ago with Dean Jackson on post-growth. It was, I think, very valuable, and I think it was the first time that I saw the fund or the IO even go close to the word post or D associated to growth. So that was great, but then needs to be just the beginning. And again on growth, and Charles, you picked up this in the recommendations, but it's the report really uses a little bit of unqualified definition of growth, and we need to go well beyond that. And also the role of the fund is to put countries in conditions to implement qualified growth pathways, and they need to play a clear role in this, and also advising countries, but it's not the role to tell countries which pathways to implement. And there are countries with very different preferences, and I think that the case study that is known to many of us is Ecuador, with its constitution that has well-being, buen vivir at its core, and over the years, when it had a certain type of government, has implemented policies that were really trying to reflect this. And now it's put in a position of going in the opposite way, and these different preferences need to be acknowledged and respected by the fund advice. I suspect I've run out of time.
You've got 2 minutes.
Shall I
If
stop?
you'd like to.
I have a couple of minutes. So maybe one more comment is on the collaboration with the World Bank, and in a sense is linked to the use of structural conditions. Now, obviously the alignment, the policy coherence and the alignment of World Bank and IMF when they go and run programs in countries is extremely important. And I think it's clear that there is convergence in this sense. But there is a risk also, because both institutions come with their conditionalities framework. And when a country is in the position of having to abide to both frameworks, it's locked in a number of conditions. And so this is not an issue that the IO in itself can decide on, but in terms of recommending where to acquire the expertise that the fund doesn't yet have, I would say that there are other actors and institutions that the fund can engage with in learning on specific issues, and especially in country circumstances. For me, a clear example was the one on the fiscal multiplier. And the fund doesn't need to speak with the bank about a country fiscal multiplier. It can speak with a country's think tank that would know more about it. And I know that this is something that the collaboration with local civil societies, you have highlighted, and I know that the fund is paying attention to it, but it's actually in the difficult part of the programs in assessing the trade-offs, that's where going beyond the bank is way more important. I'll stop here for the moment. Thank you.
Chiara, thank you for those very interesting comments. And we're moving along very nicely with time. So Rebecca, over to you and your 12 minutes.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I think I'd like to share a few slides, because I would like to show a few graphs from our work to kind of illustrate the points I'd like to make about this important work. So hopefully you can see that. Oh, that's not working exactly as I'd like. is everyone seeing my slideshow? Great. So first I want to start by congratulating the IEO team on a report that I'm sure I'll be quoting a lot. I particularly found some really interesting gems to quote about the debt operations. I thought that was an unexplored area, particularly as the world is facing a growing and looming debt crisis across the developing world right now. So thinking about growth and debt is a really important thing to be thinking about. And I know it wasn't the main point of the paper, but I'm sure I'll be citing that a lot. I want to make three basic points here. First, as the IEO report mentions, since the great financial crisis, there's been a shift in objectives from adjustment to growth. And I think that's in figure 1 of the report. And we also during this time, observers have noticed the word parsimony, of course, that conditions are going to be more streamlined towards the central objectives, not only of the fund, but of particular programs. This makes it a little tricky to track austerity or conditionality because the number of conditions may be shrinking, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the intensity of those conditions are. And so we've put together a new data set. That specifically looks at how many percentage points of GDP a borrower is expected to tighten or loosen their headline fiscal budget every year of a program since 2001. So since the beginning of the reforms that are mentioned, and also since the current fiscal definitions were set. And so rather than thinking about the number of conditions, we're looking at just that one most important condition and its intensity. And even though there's this switch to parsimony, and even though these growth objectives have taken center stage, as this IEO report notes, here's what that resulting indicator looks like over time. Positive numbers indicate a tightening or shift to more positive national budgets, and negative indicate assuming loosening or worsening budget balances. Of course, macroeconomic conditions were shifting also during this time. And when we take those into account with the model that I have on the bottom of the screen here, including growth, inflation, income levels, what really stands out to me in this is the remarkable stability of it. In other words, the general approach of how much conditionality on headline fiscal spending the IMF is expecting in these agreements has not shifted very much over this time. And that takes into account not only the type of agreement, but the overall macroeconomic situation. This is a predicted values based on a model that take these things into account. And so that's my first point that I'd like to make with regards to this report from the IEO, is that the shift towards growth focus is very welcome and important, but has been incompletely incorporated insofar as the overall fiscal space implicit in these agreements hasn't changed significantly over this time period. Of course, there's more to an agreement than simply that, but on this one particular very important metric, we haven't seen a significant change overall. And so there's room to incorporate that growth focus a little more fully or more completely. The second point I'd like to make is I was really taken by the variability in growth outcomes in the figures that we saw here from Jun and in the paper. And one of the reasons for that may be we may be able to add more depth to our understanding of that variability by the work that we did taking this new approach to thinking about austerity or conditionality and looking at the determinants of conditionality. So all of the countries in this data set have fiscal conditionality associated with an agreement. They've all gone to the fund, they've all got fiscal conditionality. So we're looking at differences with who's getting more stringent or more lenient conditionality. What are the determinants? We take into account all of these macroeconomic factors that are here on the screen, as well as incorporating connectivity, macroeconomic and diplomatic connectivity with major power centers. As Chiara said, power dynamics are always intrinsic in any economic relationship. Interestingly, the macroeconomic variables drop out of significance once we incorporate these political economy variables. And what's interesting to note here is that I've already taken out of the analysis some of the extreme outliers that were extremely lenient. For example, Iceland during the European financial crisis had a very lenient agreement, and we're not including that because it was like very based on local conditions and not necessarily able to be extrapolated to the rest of the group. And we're also taking out Iraq shortly after the invasion and occupation of that country, had an extremely austere agreement that was based on local conditions. But interestingly, the diplomatic and economic relationships, specifically with Western Europe. So we actually separate out the US and Western Europe during this time period because the European Central Bank and other European institutions were so important in deciding policy in this time period. And the fact that political economy variables are still very important, and in fact, even swamp the macroeconomic variables, may give some insight into the broad variability. I'd like to study that more, the broad variability and growth outcomes that you're seeing. And this is just part of the shift to growth is very welcome and very important, but perhaps incompletely incorporated compared to these underlying political economy variables that scholars have been noting for decades, right? We didn't come up with these questions or these variables or this model or this approach. It's all rooted in traditional IMF conditionality research. The third point I'd like to make is about the finding that health and education spending didn't significantly increase, and that the shift towards growth hasn't been reflected in improving social outcomes. And here I'll be quoting some work that Alex Kentikalenis, who's on this call, did. And so please feel free to correct me, Alex, if I misstate your work. When we also look at, in a separate paper with Alex, the impacts of the conditionality on inequality and poverty in the years thereafter. And here are the impacts 2 years after an agreement, after a QPC deadline, on the share of income by decile, with the 10th decile being the richest decile in the country and the first decile being the poorest. But you can see that in terms of distribution, more extreme positive conditionality, in other words, more austere agreements, are in fact associated with worsening inequality over that time period, especially in those middle income decile, so middle class, where labor market reforms would be particularly well felt. For example, public sector payrolls, we would expect to see that reflected in these middle deciles. Of course, there's other factors as well. And the same thing goes with the relationship with the poverty headcount at $2.50 a day. So we see there's still this tie between austerity and poverty and inequality that scholars have noted for decades. So even if growth in outcomes are beginning to improve, it's not being reflected in living standards and human well-being as thoroughly as we might like. And so this brings me to my last point about it, is that when we started looking at this, we started thinking we're going to take into account not just these QPCs, but we'll flag when there's a target on social spending. We'll flag when there's a floor on social spending on it through an indicative target and see if that impacts it. And the truth was they were so sporadically implemented and so sporadically mentioned that it didn't even make sense to include them in a systematic way. And so one of the recommendations that kind of naturally flows from this is that I think it seems clear that you're right, that there hasn't been enough attention paid to protecting living standards, particularly vulnerable communities. Although the shift towards a growth focus is very welcome and important, it's not away from simply an adjustment-focused objective. It hasn't completely protected vulnerable communities, and it hasn't necessarily reliably allowed fiscal space, generally speaking. And again, I'll just close by saying I did find this extremely informative, and I really appreciate it. And I'm so glad we have an opportunity to talk about it. So I look forward to the Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you again, Chiara, to really interesting takes on what itself is a really interesting paper. So as you say, it stands us in good stead for a conversation. I'd first, as I've mentioned, like to go back to Charles and Jun, just for any initial statement that you might have on the remarks that have been made by our two discussants. Just to recap as well, for the sake of the audience, if you'd indulge me, but some of the key points, I think, first from Chiara in terms of there may be contradictions between the findings and the headline conclusions. In Chiara's example case or emblematic case with regards to austerity. Then Chiara also mentioned the need to consider the relationship and power dynamics beneath conditionality. And in the area of growth, I was also speaking about the need for actually some of the more major challenges perhaps going on in the global economy with regards to an energy transition with equitable outcomes, and also a point from Chiara on IMF collaboration with World Bank and the need for there to be other organizations invited to the party, so to speak. And Rebecca, as we've just heard, talking about the perceived stability in IMF's approach on conditionality, at least in terms of headline fiscal spending. Again, Rebecca also mentioned the power dynamics that you could see playing out in the data, and well, the events of the last sort of 4 or 5 days with regards to reports on World Bank practices does obviously bring this power dynamic question into acute focus. And then final point in terms of worsening inequality or declining income share from Rebecca as well. So perhaps Jun, as the first speaker, if I could go back to you first for any remarks that you have on these comments.
Let me answer or respond to the kind of austerity bias questions raised by Chiara and also by Rebecca. My response would be first to highlight that, of course, the findings we discussed in the report and in this presentation is obviously the average relationship across programs. So that is the limitation of the cross-country analysis, and that's the reason why we also conducted 17 country case studies to complement that. So this relationship, average relationship, could mask a lot of cross-country variation, obviously. But when you talk about austerity bias, I have to say, yes, our finding does not indicate that there is no austerity bias whatsoever in the fund programs. Indeed, given the large need for a large amount of adjustment to correct BOP problems, it is not surprising to find some austerity bias in fund programs. It is in some sense necessary. The more relevant question is whether this austerity bias is excessive or not. So we have to think about a few benchmarks. The number one and bottom line benchmark is obviously the counterfactual of no funding engagement, and that's we focus on that, and we found that yes, fund programs has the positive growth impacts, and this is the bottom line. So we can say, well, fund program did good job at least to beat the alternative scenario of no funding program engagement. The second benchmark is obviously whether other benchmarks, such as, for example, the historical norms I discussed in my presentation, is basically serves for that purpose. For example, we want to get rid of all the gross impact of external factors and from past trends, which is beyond the control of the fund staff or country authorities during the program. So this deviation from these historical norms are largely negative, particularly in GRA programs, which is not surprising at all to me. The question is whether they are quite significantly different from zero. And in our analysis, we found that the significant cases were not that many. And if there are any things like that, it's mostly on the crisis programs, which has a humongous amount of adjustment need, and actually the BOP pressure is quite acute. Mostly in case of the very sudden stops in capital flow and large capital outflows, requires a very sharp adjustment in the current account, which means that there's a lot of adjustment need. So it's not surprising to me that the whole pattern of this deviation from historical norms are quite in line with our expectation. And then what we found that, yes, except for in this kind of a crisis program context, we found the deviations are modest and in many cases not significant. So that is another basis for our conclusion that we didn't find evidence, consistent evidence toward excessive austerity. Another dimension that we have to think about when you talk about austerity bias is that some kind of distinction between the short run and medium run. For example, Rebecca's analysis is quite interesting and is really provides a lot of food for thought. But I believe also that the Euro result may focus more on the very short run impact on income distribution, short run impact on growth, for example. But it is possible that addressing the very difficult underlying BOP problems may have some casualties in terms of worsening income distribution, in terms of less than adequate growth outcomes. But the question is whether this kind of a cost paid during the program may well be paid off later over the medium term with higher growth and more sustainable growth paths, and plus more improved income distribution. We know that higher growth will bring some positive impact on income distribution. Also, still there's evidence is not fully consistent across many different studies, but hopefully the embarking on or going back to a more sustainable and higher path of growth hopefully can make some good contribution to improving the income distribution and social aspects of growth. So when you talk about this quality versus quantity of the growth, I think there's no simple answer for that. And there is a more complicated issues are, as I said earlier, the distinction between or trade-off between short run and medium run, and also how we look at the growth outcomes relative to what benchmark. I think that is, so I think probably our findings and our conclusions in that sense is not that congratulatory. We found it, we did quite positive findings, but our analysis is based on a different benchmarks and a different perspective on the trade-off between short and medium term. I think I'll stop here.
Thanks, Jun. Charles, I'll pass straight over to you.
No, thanks very much. I'll try to be relatively brief so we can turn to questions from others. But thanks to Jun for responding on the quite difficult technical issue of what we mean by excessive austerity in fund programs. I mean, it is a complex topic, and we're certainly not trying to say there is no austerity in fund programs. We're just saying it doesn't necessarily go beyond what is required for adjustment purposes in a macroeconomic sense. But having said that, I'd like to sort of pick up on a couple of points made by Chiara and Rebecca that I thought were very appropriate, and I think I would like to reinforce them. I think one point that you ended with, Chiara, is that we shouldn't pay too much attention to growth outcomes at the aggregate level, but rather think about the quality dimensions of growth in a more sort of open way. So I wouldn't go quite as far as Tim Jackson to say that we should be post-growth. I think for low-income countries, that's going too far. Maybe it's fine for the United States, but I don't think it's a good message for Africa. But growth does need to be achieved in a way that is environmentally sustainable and is inclusive and helps low-income and vulnerable households. And frankly, our report found it very difficult to evaluate those dimensions because the data is not there. So I think we go quite deeply into the macro aspects, but we don't really get into these quality aspects. And I'm hopeful that in the next stage, there will be continuing work, including by you and others on this call, to push more into the evidence on the quality of growth, and to push the fund to be more attentive to these aspects. And one sort of open issue, I think, for the fund is, what should be the attention paid to distributional issues, to environmental, to climate issues in providing resources to countries. I think it does require the fund to sort of reopen its conditionality guidelines and the guidance it provides to staff to think hard about these issues. And I would hope that those would be tasks that will be taken on in the implementation plan that will be developed in response to this report. So, if you and other members of civil society were to push in that direction, I think what we've done is sort of open up an opportunity for you can leverage what we have done and go further to push the fund in the direction that you think is appropriate. And similarly, to respond to one of Rebecca's comments, it was an interesting chart you shared that there hasn't been a change in the overall aggregate rate of fiscal adjustment per year. But I think the question then becomes, well, what about the composition of that fiscal adjustment? You need a certain amount of fiscal adjustment to achieve external adjustment, but can you do that fiscal adjustment in a way that is more growth friendly, that is more supportive of low income and vulnerable groups, that is more environmentally sustainable? And the initial evidence we presented in the report suggests that not as much progress has been made in those areas than I think the fund would like to think. So the evidence, for example, on social spending, we don't find much support for significant increases in social spending. We don't have data on impact on inequality, but I think certainly that would be worth investigating further. So I would really encourage civil society to sort of go further than we were able to do. What was already a very long report into some issues that are certainly of great importance and should be taken up by the fund in following up to the evaluation. Let me stop there.
Thank you, both. And to say, I will invite Chiara and Rebecca at the conclusion of the conversation to make any final remarks they might like. Some of the comments are directly pointed to them. But now I'd like to turn the attention to the other participants on the call, taking questions from them. As I said, please either post a comment or a little star in the chat group, or even more options, just stick up your virtual hand. I'd like to take, and bear in mind as well, we're not going to have that much time for various rounds, so I'd put your questions in early if you have something to ask. So I'll turn to those who have drawn my attention thus far. And please, when prior to stating a question, obviously introduce yourself such that all are aware. Let me first pass then to Nabil.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so hi everyone. So I'm Nabil from Oxfam. So yeah, I mean, I won't repeat what my colleagues in CESO said, and regarding also the issue of austerity, because I mean, I'll leave it to them to respond. But also, I think it confirms that the assessment of austerity or austerity is related. You are linking it to the growth result, which also is. I don't think that. I mean, I don't agree with this approach, but I'll leave it to them to respond. But maybe I'll raise other issues. Also, I mean, regarding the issues of the growth also, which I think that there is not enough mention or not mention about like what were the drivers of growth, in a sense, like whether this growth has been driven by commodities export or extractives or any kind of, also to assess the sustainability, not only the environmental sustainability, but also how much this growth is sustainable over time. And it seems that it is very much focused on the IMF programs, that we don't see the other variables that might impact it. And when there is a significant negative variance from projections, it seems that it's more related to external shocks rather than to the interventions, but not necessarily when it's positive. There's no this kind of linking to maybe external factors as well. So I think it would be good to look more into that. But maybe another issue I wanted to point out is that I think the report, for example, like we said, it found that growth projections were optimistic because of political economic consideration, which I think I'm encouraged that it features like that, and I think it merits further examination on why IMF staff in countries, they need to be over optimistic on growth prospects in order to make programs more, if you want, more sellable. And I think it merits further further examination of this. But also, I mean, what is more concerning is also on some of the examples. For example, it contrasted Egypt with Tunisia and Jordan, putting Egypt as a case study for how the government, there was political buy-in and early decisive actions that had the authorities to avoid reform and donor fatigue. And it contrasted to Tunisia and Jordan. However, it's fair to mention that the stark difference between the two is that protesters, dissidents in Egypt face retaliation, imprisonment, and repression, while in Tunisia and Jordan, they allow different degrees of dissent, and protest is allowed, and all of that. So I think it also merits the link between the successful IMF program and the closing of civic space. So does it say that the more the space is closed, that there is more political buy-in and decisive action to implement the program, then it is positive for its successful implementation? I think this is very concerning, because political economic considerations are not only on whether populations or the government like the growth projections, but political economic considerations should also see into those other dynamics where governments have an iron grip on civil society. So there's no protest, no anything. So the fund assumes that there is a broad buy-in from the country. And I think this merits also further exploration. And thank you very much for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. Very interesting. I'll also take the other questions mentioned in the chat. So over to you, Luis.
Thank you very much. Luis Vieira with the Bretton Woods Project. I think the others are quite pleased with the focus on the report on looking beyond growth into equity impacts. I was following up on a couple key points made by Chiara and Rebecca. The issue of political economy of the programming, and also the related need for cooperation with other partners. It's interesting to me that, and I understand to a certain extent why the report focused on the partnership with the World Bank. But I recall that when we had a discussion on the IEO's own investigation of the fund's relationships, at least some of us made quite a strong point, that we tried to make quite a strong point to broaden the cooperation beyond the bank, particularly as it relates to issues of equity, right? I think we would argue that the bank is not necessarily best placed to input into those areas, or at least that there are very divergent views from other UN agencies, civil society participants, etc. So I wonder, what, in light of the recent developments of the Doing Business report, etc., and the political economy framework that was raised, I wonder what the IEO thinks will be necessary, or if you have specific ideas of what the type of structural changes that are needed within the bank itself to ensure, as you suggest, that ex ante impact assessments are done in terms of the distributional impacts of these policies. B, that those assessments are informed by better political economy analysis within the country, including for outreach with domestic actors. And C, what, if anything, have the recent news about the doing business report and the manipulation of data within the World Bank, does that change anything in your approach vis-a-vis its relationship with the bank? Thank you.
Cheers, Luis. And I might also, well, I am in fact going to ask a question myself because I would like to, and it's related to the second recommendation stated by the IEO, that is that IMF-supported programs should pay greater attention to supporting deep, more growth-oriented structural reforms. And Charles, in your exposition on this point, you talked about deeper impediments to growth, underlying distortions, areas that you say the fund doesn't have a great expertise in, and therefore would need to collaborate with partners, as Luis has just mentioned. But just to understand then, what can you give some examples of what these further impediments are? And because this is a recommendation, what would the fund work look like in your mind if it followed this recommendation? How different would the fund look? Is my question. So if we could hear your views on those three interventions, starting again with Jun.
Thank you, Chris. Let me respond to Neville's questions about the drivers of growth. We didn't take a very close look at those issues, but at least I can provide some cases based on country experience. For example, when we provided some look at the gross deviations from historical norms, as shown in the chart in the presentation material, some programs, they recorded a very large and positive deviation from historical norms. Because these historical norms have already taken into account the impact of external factors such as the terms of trade, trading partners' growth, and US interest rate, etc. So the commodity price impact is already captured, not perfectly, of course, but at least in large part captured by the inclusion of the terms of trade variable in the estimation of the benchmark. So any gross deviations from that, the historical norms, particularly the positive deviation, they are most likely coming from the supply side factors, the domestic supply side factors. And as we spelled out in our report, there are a few cases. For example, the 2009 Ghana program case, this kind of positive deviation was explained by new mines coming on stream and the good harvest during the program period. And then in case of Grenada, there was rebound in agriculture and buoyant tourism. And in case of Senegal, there is a lot of stimulus from the large-scale public investment financed by capital inflow. So the drivers of growth are quite diverse across countries, and of course, the most important element, at least in the short run or during the program, is of course the program, the adjustment in fiscal policy or other monetary policy and financial policy or exchange rate even. So I'll tell you that is, commodity price, yes, has mattered, of course, always, as always, but also the deviation from historical norms are pretty much influenced by the adjustment envisaged in the program count, and also some supply side factors which were not expected. Political economic factors, yes, I think we believe that there are important aspects of fund programs, but as Charles already mentioned previously, it's quite difficult to do any major cross-country analysis based on the impact or influence of political economic factors on growth outcomes or adjustment outcomes and their consequences on or social and distributional consequences of growth outcomes. So, but as Charles already said, because there's data limitation for other things, but as time goes by, probably will be more research could be done on this aspect. Let me stop here and probably Charles can answer some of your questions.
Thanks, Jun. Let me respond to the questions and comments made by Luis and Chris on the role of the World Bank and the question of who should the fund be partnering with as it broadens its attention to growth-related issues. I think the World Bank is the long-time partner of the fund. It's a natural partner of the fund. It has a complementary mandate. It has a consistent set of shareholders, and perhaps even more important, it has the depth of expertise and experience in areas like social protection programs, working on public sector pricing issues and state-owned enterprises that I think are particularly relevant. But certainly, I don't want to suggest that the World Bank should be the only partner that the fund would work with. And indeed, I would also recognize that the fund and the World Bank have not always been the most effective partners in the past. In fact, we did an evaluation last year on collaboration with the World Bank on issues like climate and inequality that found that the collaboration with the bank was quite uneven, and that often collaboration with other partners was stronger than with the World Bank. So I certainly don't want to suggest that the World Bank is the immediate panacea to the question of how does the fund pay more attention to structural issues relevant to growth. But I think it has to be part of the solution, given its scale and its capacity. The question is how do you make sure that the fund and the bank are able to work well together and effectively to deal with some of these deep issues that we are raising. On the issue of that Chris raised of how different would the fund look if it were to take seriously our recommendation to pay substantially more attention to the structural impediments to growth, I think it would look significantly different in the sense that it really would need to shift away from a parsimonious approach that overwhelmingly concentrates on fixing adjustment problems without paying attention to issues that are really important for countries to achieve the longer term economic performance that are needed to escape from a continuing cycle of boom and bust. The fund would need to invest quite significantly in people who are able to understand these issues and interact with experts in other institutions. The fund cannot just outsource these issues. To be a good partner, the fund itself has to contribute so that the partner institution sees the benefit of working with the fund rather than seeing the fund as just someone who's trying to come in and impose on them what the fund thinks is appropriate. So those are quite substantial changes to the way the fund works on these issues. And I would again recommend taking another look at this evaluation we did last year on the fund's partnership with the bank, which I think has some very relevant lessons that are becoming even more important as we go ahead, as the fund extends its work into these more structural areas going ahead. So I really think that's going to be a crucial issue going ahead. Is how does the fund and the bank work better together? I'll stop there.
Sorry, Chris, may I come in and just, Charles, could I press you a little bit to answer the question related to the political economy issues raised by Rebecca? What, if anything, do you think that the bank can do, or the fund rather, sorry, can do to address, well, first of all, do you accept the premise that there are differential outcomes depending on the geopolitical positioning of countries? And if you do, then what can be done to address those, if anything?
Quite sure I fully grasp what you're saying there. I mean, the fund always has to work with its membership. The fund supports the country government's objectives. The fund cannot impose its own values on what the country ought to be aiming to do. It's helping the country to achieve the objectives of the recognized government of the country. The fund has to do that in a subtle way that appreciates the political economy of the country. But the fund does not come in and impose its own views on what countries ought to be aiming at achieving.
I'm gonna have to accept a limited, or that as the total response with an awareness of time. We are in fact at time, and I am loath for when these kind of events overextend. That said, I would just want to check in with Chiara and Rebecca if they have any really headline 30 to 60 second comments that they'd like to make as we wrap up. Starting with Rebecca.
I do have one, thank you. I think that a question about whether short-term inequality and poverty sacrifices translate into longer-term sustainable and inclusive growth trajectories is worthy to have if those sacrifices are indeed being made on the altar of long-term sustainable and inclusive growth. But our work on the political economy determinants of austerity shows that actually those macroeconomic considerations tend to drop out of significance when we also include the importance of diplomatic and commercial and investment relationships with Western Europe. And there isn't literature saying what's the ideal amount of accommodating the desires of Western European investors, importers, or United Nations representatives for long-term sustainable and inclusive growth. And so I would say that any austerity that is a sacrifice on the altar of accommodating the wishes of particular geopolitical powers might be considered excessive. And until we can differentiate that and say, can we clean this up and eliminate that political economy pressure, which we know existed during the European financial crisis, of pressure not originating at the IMF even, originating sometimes from the European Central Bank or countries' desire to meet the Maastricht Treaty in order to gain accession into the European Union. Until those external conditions are no longer reflected in the level of sacrifice that economies are expected to make in terms of poverty and inequality, those sacrifices are excessive when it comes to the goals of long-term sustainable and inclusive growth, which I share, and I think most of us share here on this panel. That'll be my final word. Thank you.
Appreciated, Rebecca. Thank you. And Chiara, any closing remarks?
Well, I definitely liked Rebecca's remarks, but two things I'm taking away. I am at this point looking forward to see what the implementation plan of the board is going to be. Charles, I think we are going to take on your invitation to then carry forward the discussion with the board on how this is going to look. And the other thing is that I think, well, it would have been even before last week, but even more, this is a wonderful time to rethink the relationship between the World Bank and the IMF, and how both approach the relationship with countries, governments in the policy advice. So I look forward for discussion to that sense.
Thank you, Chiara. And with that, I'd like to draw us to a close. And this space ultimately, like of IEOs, the IEO, CSO, and academia is basically people interested, acutely attentive to what happens in this case, the IMF. But it's always useful for having these discussions. And I hope that this roundtable has either helped understand, to enhance your understanding of this important work from the IEO, understand the issues around it, and or to help you see the civil society and academia perspectives on the issues that are in play. I'd like to thank, just to conclude, the IEO for helping to put this together, and a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure it ran smoothly. So thank you, everyone, particularly to the four presenters, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much to you, Christopher, for moderating. And thank you so much for this opportunity to engage. So important and powerful.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Go.
Chiara and everybody. Thanks.